The Center for Performing Arts, you know, is a community organization. And it's because we have people like you who come and see our shows, who are members, who send their children to our classes. It's the only reason we're open. Places like us, we represent 99% of the theater in the United States of America. 99%. And what we're doing tonight is an expression of what community is all about. Pastor Perez has a novel, and we're going to hear excerpts from this novel tonight. He likes to hide his light under a bushel, but I would like to give him a round of applause before we begin. So tonight's reading is also accompanied by music. So let me introduce to you now our orchestra, led by Roberto Rodriguez. Gentlemen. And our cast.
The last name, Maldonado, is made up of two words, mal and donado. Those words can mean bad donation. There were days when William Maldonado saw the twist of irony in his last name. He felt that fate had condemned him to a life of bad fortune, that he was constantly mired in grief and embroiled in conflict, and that Puerto Ricans have a word for conflict, and that word is revolú. A revolú gives you all sorts of reasons to believe that your life has been jinxed by a bizarre conflict or a messy controversy. One fateful day, Maldonado was returning from a long stay in Puerto Rico to a New Jersey town where he'd lived for many years, when a revolú at a New York airport created a distraction that resulted in his possession of another person's car. That story goes something like this. Maldonado heard a man exclaiming, "Ay, mami!" Mami in Spanish can mean sexy baby. "If you cook like you walk, I will eat everything, even the scraps." A stoutly built man was flirting with a pretty young thing as she struggled with her luggage. He adjusted his hat at a rakish angle, put his car in neutral, and emerged from the car, leaving the keys in the ignition. Using his suave charm and macho strength, he hoisted the woman's suitcase on his shoulder and marched inside the terminal with the sexy damsel trailing 3 steps behind him. William Maldonado, who had been standing nearby waiting for a bus, took advantage of the fact that the car was unoccupied, with the motor running. He jumped into the car and sped away. In an instant, the ex-con Maldonado, waiting for a bus that would deliver him to a halfway house, left the path to his social rehabilitation and was once again on the road as a fugitive.
On the horizon, gray clouds unfurled like a canopy across the sky. To Maldonado, the darkness brought on the scene of a barreling storm. In a flash, the car was struck by rain mixed with hail. The torrential drubbing on the car's retractable roof sounded like bursting popcorn. Crystal drops of ice bounced off the car's hood, resembling marbles. The car slid and nearly collided into a doubled-parked station wagon, where a young man, Javier Martinez, wearing a vintage sheepskin coat, was unloading grocery bags from the wagon's tailgate. The shock of the near-miss accident forced Maldonado to maneuver the slippery streets. He realized that any accident he might be in would require him to furnish identification that he didn't have, and compromise his new status as a fugitive from justice. What mattered most to him at that moment was finding a place to ditch the hatchback sedan he had just stolen. Where can I abandon this car? How can I get rid of this problem? Maldonado mused. I've got to get this right. I may not have many more chances to achieve what I'm going after. Sometimes, a révolu makes you look at life like a romantic, even though there is the risk of being left heartbroken. Maldonado closed his eyes and let the Baroque music infiltrate his thoughts. Instantly, he zoned out, his mind escaping his present dilemma as he revisited his early childhood in Puerto Rico. He recalled a glowing candle, flickering and barely illuminating a 5x7 framed picture of his father wearing a winter blue U.S. Navy uniform. Next to the framed picture was a 3-point folded American flag inside a memorial case with 2 ribbon medals. Mama would always say that Dad was on an extended trip overseas, Maldonado recalled. One day, I was old enough to understand that his soul was permanently docked at the harbor of a celestial city beyond time and space. Maldonado forgot momentarily that he was parked illegally, and he continued to revel in the enduring memories of his mother. He remembered the scent of jasmine on her long, wavy hair, and how she sat on the edge of the bed, humming him a lullaby whenever he felt afraid. Though she passed away when he was a young adult, he was still grieving her death and lamented not having her around for moments like the one he was experiencing in this shaky period of his life. If Mama were only here, he murmured as the engine gently idled. She always made everything bad go away. Maldonado started to settle down, but in his personal universe, moments of tranquility were lived in brief spurts. Just when his mind and spirit were experiencing peace, an alarming cacophony grew closer and closer. He felt terrified once again.
Aye, and now what? He shouted angrily. How the hell is this possible? An emergency car of some sort barreled down on Maldonado. He tilted his seat all the way back to 180 degrees, pressing himself into it and crouching to hide his presence in the stolen car. With each of the siren's electrifying screeches, his nerves altered, and he felt his body contracting to a fetal position. He recalled the day more than 10 years ago when he lay down on the sofa in a similar posture, listening to a macabre-styled piece of music in his apartment. Maldonado had been waiting 48 hours, hoping to hear back from his business partner, Angel Santana, about the insurance fraud case that he was accused of perpetrating. On that day, someone entered the building and ran up the stairs. The visitor knocked repeatedly on Maldonado's door with a fierce thump, causing his heart to palpitate with anxiety. Guillo, it's me. It is the voice of Gregorio Santana, the son of his business partner. Maldonado swung the door wide open, thinking it was Angel, the father, but it was Santana's oldest son, Gregorio. You sound more and more like your father. Where is he? Gregorio did not respond. He barreled into the apartment, grasping for air and trying to conceal his forearms, which were covered with nicks, scars, and little gouges. Maldonado also noticed that Gregorio's hazel eyes were watery, and his wavy mane, which hung over his ears, was disheveled. My father would have loved to be here, but he couldn't. He would have been followed here. He would have led an angry mob to your doorstep, Gregorio said. An angry mob? Maldonado wondered if he was hearing him correctly. Yes, sirree, it's bad. They are saying you are a scam artist and that you hoodwink people with fake insurance, said Gregorio. What did we do? Said Maldonado, puzzled and thinking, of course, that the you was collective. You meaning Maldonado, Angel, Gregorio, and the others who were working in the business. Gregorio immediately indicated that he was not part of this business troubles. I have nothing to do with the mess that is going on. The bottom line is that the new insurance company does not exist. People thought they had insurance coverage, and they didn't. You're being labeled a charlatan. It looks like you are carrying out a shell game. Maldonado realized that the you meant him alone. How is this possible? How can I be accused of fraud? I don't know, Gregorio said in a childlike whisper. Maldonado resumed. You were the one who talked me into finding a new company to help the customers save money. You had me talk to the headquarters over the phone. You mailed out the declaration letters to each customer. Those letters provided clear and specific information on how much coverage each client would get, Maldonado said. We messed up, Gregorio intoned in a somber voice. The declaration letters should have not come from our office, but directly from the insurance company. We are simply the middleman. To make matters worse, my father's not insured as the agent to cover the exposure. His coverage lapsed, Gregorio said. Gregorio adopted a scare tactic, going as far to suggest that gang members were on a prowl for Maldonado. He urged them to flee You have to leave the area. They're coming for you. You must leave immediately. Some of the victims have told their story to family members with gang ties. The word on the street is that those dudes are riled up and that they are threatening to put serious hurt on you. I am willing to face my accusers. I can overcome this problem if your father stands by my side, said Maldonado. You know that I am innocent. I can argue my way out of anything. By the way, your father is not returning my calls. What is going on? He is depressed, Gregorio said. Dad bought you a one-way ticket under an alias to help you get out here in one piece. He've asked me to tell you that he will send for you when things get cleared up, Gregorio said. Maldonado was confused, but he grabbed the plane ticket. He and Gregorio take him to the airport and board a flight to San Juan. There, within 6 months, Maldonado found work as a policy analyst for an elected official. He quickly became the chief of staff. But after 5 years on the job, he ended up in prison for obstructing a bribery investigation case involving the politician who had hired him. So far, fleeing the devil in his Jersey City business debacle, he was unwittingly back in his clutches because of another stroke of bad luck. In a prison cell, Maldonado tried to discern who or what was responsible for his predicament. He considered the possibilities and wrote them down in a journal, along with the questions on his mind. Why am I not recognized as an intellectual genius, the academic artiste that I am? Why am I always hitching myself to the wrong people? Maldonado was in a mental state that it wouldn't let him move on. He was angry at the world and wanted someone to pay for his lot in life. He channeled his anger towards Santana. He wanted to know why Santana never sent for him or returned his phone calls from Puerto Rico. As his sentence was winding down, he was allowed to leave Puerto Rico to finish his time in a halfway house. He jumped on the plane to New Jersey and then promptly stole a car. The moment he got behind the stolen wheel, Maldonado reasoned to himself. With the mind of the convict he had become, contrary to his real character, you have to steal because life will take everything away from you.
The passing emergency vehicle's siren had long faded. Maldonado snapped out of his deep thoughts and ran his hand through the layers of his clothing, feeling around for a black cocoa-beaded rosary that was given to him by his mother as a confirmation gift when he was only 12. He carried it as an amulet, and every time he was in a quandary, he would rediscover a conduit to God in his side pocket. "My God, help me," he muttered in a hushed voice. "I just want to settle down." Maldonado felt a sense of relief when he noticed that a parked car was flashing its left signal light in preparation to pulling out of the space and enter the driving lane. "Finally, something goes my way," he said, recognizing the soon-to-be vacant parking space as a blessing. "All right, just move out and move on," Maldonado implored, talking aloud inside his head, inside this car, as if his words would transmit through the doors of his car and the other drivers. "Come on, what's taking so long?" he said, and then immediately regretted his own impatience. Should I get out of my car or not? What if the person inside the other car recognizes me and calls the cops at the corner payphone? Maldonado tried to remain positive and think positive, but it didn't take long for him to realize that the car in the parking space he needed was stuck in the space. The driver was a classy-looking lady in a classy-looking car, a red Lincoln Continental Mark VI. Maldonado got out of his car and headed toward the helpless driver to offer his assistance. "I will help you, ma'am," Maldonado said. "I'll be right back. Just keep the engine running." Before he had a chance to turn around and walk away, the woman inside the car pursed her lips with an air of composure, as if determined to extricate her car through force of will. This was a woman who was used to being in charge. The woman was Bridget Santini, a well-regarded and highly successful local retailer of women's clothes. "You don't have to," she exclaimed. "If I honk my horn long enough, one of my husband's workers will come dig me out." Maldonado knew that he had to make a good impression quickly. He covered his nose with his monogrammed handkerchief to avoid inhaling the car's sooty and noxious fumes. He used the side of his foot to kick the snow away from the tires. He lasted a few minutes doing this, but the heaps of snow were difficult to remove. "Pull out! This time it will work!" he yelled at the lady in distress. The car's back tires started spinning, and the car's engine roared, but there was no forward movement out of the space. He tapped on the window to present her with another idea that might work. As he spoke, he was forced to react to an odd remark he heard over his shoulder that came from a man who seemed to appear from out of nowhere.
The figure, like an apparition, was a limping vagrant. He dragged his right foot as he filled the brisk air with a charming jingle. "If you have some spare change, my generosity has boundless range." Scrappin' Steve, as he was known locally, was a college student and vagabond who pounded the streets for cash-yielding opportunities. One of Steve's economic niches was turning scraps and discarded materials into recyclables. That's how he made a living. He rattled them around in a grocery cart that he borrowed from Felix's, Fine Foods, a family-owned supermarket in the heart of the Spanish-speaking downtown. I don't have a good feeling about this bum, said Maldonado to himself. Maldonado forced a weak smile and waved Steve away. Everything's under control, Maldonado said. Yo, homie, I was checking you out from over there, Steve said, and what you were doing is dangerous. If the car skates backwards, it's going to bowl you over and pin you against the fender of the car sitting behind you. Maldonado broke in. I was trying to... Steve interrupted him insistently. Nah, man. You are more lost than a cross-eyed service dog. You have to dig deep trenches around the outside part of the front wheels so that she can properly position them at 30 degrees. Then you have to create a small path and layer the surface with dirt or something solid, like a plank, so that the wheels can get a firm traction to run on. Maldonado was not amused by Scrap and Steve's canine analogy, comparing him to an inept service dog. But he was mildly impressed by the junk man's intelligence. This guy is not a fool. With the push of a button, Bridget lowered her car window all the way down, popped her head halfway out, and greeted Steve in a sweet tone. She knows him, Maldonado started to wonder. Not only is this guy sharp, he is well connected. Who is this guy? It took some ingenuity and a small dose of patience, but Steve and Maldonado were able to work together and dislodge Mrs. Santini's car from the snow and ice. Mrs. Santini pulled away, but not before gently tapping her horn twice and waving goodbye. Maldonado, for his part, did not think that he owed Steve anything. He jumped into his car without saying a word, driving forward a bit to block the space.
Sometimes a révolu is like the scent of a cheap perfume. It sticks to you, and it is hard to get it off. After Maldonado jumped into his hot car, he thought that Steve would walk away, but he didn't. Steve was preoccupied with the thought that another car might appear out of nowhere and jump into the newly available parking spot. So Steve stood on the open parking spot. "This is you," Steve said, as he simultaneously pointed downward to the vacant space and walked backward onto the curb. "Come in slowly. This is you. A little closer. This is you," Steve said. "God forbid that this guy thinks he's now my friend. He can't know anything else about me," Maldonado said to himself, trying to ease himself painlessly out of the thin bond that had formed by the shared success of freeing Mrs. Bridget Santini. "Have to slow this guy down," muttered Steve, also recognizing the need to formulate his own strategy for shaping his interaction with this stranger. Steve had decided he would contain Maldonado through engagement. Just talk to the guy about anything that interests guys: cars, business, sex, sports. There must be something that will make Maldonado talk. Steve started to ask casual but incisive questions. "You're traveling, right? You're not from around here." There were conspicuous signs that Maldonado was from the tropics. He was wearing a pair of topsider boating shoes on a wintry day. His complexion radiated a shiny bronze color. He spoke English with a sing-song accent. "What makes you think that I am not?" Maldonado said. Steve responded to the question with a sarcastic compliment. "Nice tan, bro." Steve glanced at the inside of the car and then at Maldonado. He looked inside the car again and noticed a 26-inch hard case suitcase lodged between the front and back seat of the car. Steve, who saw a funny side to almost everything, called attention to the luggage with a wisecrack. "Homie, the only time I see a guy around here carrying a suitcase in his wheels is when his girl puts him out for doing something stupid." Steve broke into a silly laugh. "What'd you get busted for? Were you fooling around?" Steve said. "Did you get fired from your job? And she ain't gonna take care of you anymore." With icy eyes and a curt tone, Maldonado felt forced to reply, "Oh, you are so imaginative." Maldonado was not about to reveal to this vagrant that his original destination was the Healing Hearts Halfway House, which was a condition of his parole from the jail in Puerto Rico, and that the vehicle they had just parked with great care was a stolen car. There was something about Maldonado's enigmatic demeanor that sparked a fascination in Steve's mind. "Let me treat you to a cup of coffee," said Steve. "I can't. I have research to do." "I know the perfect place. It's clean and quiet." Maldonado asked, "Where?" Steve responded, "The library." Things fell into place for Maldonado. The library was an ideal location for him to quietly evaluate his next moves. Steve, nonetheless, noticing too many inconsistencies in Maldonado's behavior, felt that he had to ask Maldonado a series of questions. Steve did. He discovered that Maldonado was a research scholar with dubious intentions.
Sometimes a revolute is waiting for you on the other side of the door. Finally, they arrived at the library. They walked past 2 ornate lampposts and faced doors of modern glass with a hazy surface. The glass was an apropos metaphor since the life was foggy for Maldonado. He did not know what opportunities life had for him on the other side once the hinges to the door swung open. His hands were in the fate of a vagrant he just met. Getting acquainted with Steve came with the dread of the vagrant's displays of immaturity, unpredictable behavior, and heavy scent resulting from unreliable and infrequent street hygiene. Maldonado, however, did not dwell on the vagrant's flaws. The vagrant provided perfect company for an imperfect moment. Steve opened the doors and deferred to Maldonado. "After you, Professor," Steve said. Maldonado entered, walking with stiffly upright posture past the first and second set of doors, 2 wood pocket doors, each with a brass handle. He walked under a brass chandelier and stepped onto the foyer's marble steps. His feet were squishy and wet with discomfort. It occurred to him to dry his wet socks on a cast-iron radiator, if he could find one that was away from the public view. Shortly after entering the foyer, Maldonado met Steve's close childhood friend, Eduardo Cruz, who preferred to be addressed by his Americanized name, Eddie Cross. Maldonado's first encounter with Eddie immediately set off alarms in his head. He was ready to run. Eddie is a security guard at the library, whose uniform resembles the design and color patterns worn by police officers from the island he just left after years of incarceration. The tension eased up when Steve and Eddie greeted each other with a funky soul handshake that culminated in a chest bump. Maldonado let out a sigh of relief. Eddie was not a cop after all. Steve then introduced Eddie as a research scholar. Maldonado excused himself from Steve and Eddie after the 2 old friends became embroiled in a passionate conversation about who was the best second baseman of all time. Maldonado found the conversation to be shallow and a waste of his time. Maldonado was eager to review old newspapers, to find out how he was perceived in light of the insurance fraud he had been accused of perpetrating. He proceeded to the library's microfilm room, where he discovered firsthand how he had been portrayed by the media as a scam artist, and how his former partner Santana remained silent and never said a word to clear his name from any wrongdoing with the general public. Maldonado was angry, but he realized that he did not have the luxury of dwelling on past newspaper stories. He was determined to confront his former partner, Angel Santana, get some answers, and avenge his losses. To do that, though, he needed to remain anonymous and above suspicion. He looked at help wanted ads for a job that would allow him to keep a low profile. His research paid dividends when he discovered an opening for a church sexton at a Spanish-speaking Pentecostal church that offered the possibility of free housing on the church grounds. "This is it," Maldonado exclaimed, jubilant at his sudden good fortune. And as he read on, there was a potentially significant discovery in the advertisement that had made his heart leap for joy. The name of the church's minister? Angel Santana. "I can't believe this. Is this a coincidence or what?" The slightly bewildered Maldonado said in hushed tones. He plunged his left hand into his pocket in search of his rosary. He held the sacred object in his fist. It helped him contain his excitement. He unclasped the rosary in his pocket. He was motivated to find out if there was any merit to his discovery. It dawned on him that perhaps the safest route was to talk to Steve, who was an apparently well-connected street person. Perhaps he knew something about the minister in the church listed in the advertisement. Maldonado looked around for Steve, and when he found him, he asked, "Do you know anything about the House of Mercy Pentecostal Church?" A sudden questioning look came over Steve's face. He wondered what Maldonado was after, but he nonetheless answered the question. "That is my home church," Steve said, "but I don't go there anymore." Maldonado wanted to know the reason why, may I ask? Although very personal, Steve felt compelled to admit the reason to this stranger. "That is where my dad Chico goes. We don't get along." "How about the pastor? What can you tell me about him?" Maldonado was eager for the rumors of the clergyman's past or just a physical description that would confirm his hunch. Instead, the vagrant provided a window into the pastor's soul. "He's a good man, always helping people out who don't deserve to be helped, but he's got his hands full with people in that place," Steve said. "What is going on?" Maldonado said. "They're trying to get rid of him," Steve said. "Why?" Maldonado asked. "Politics, man. There are too many pastors in that place," Steve responded. "So they must have a large congregation to have more than one minister on staff," Maldonado said. "That is not what I'm saying. There are too many people with a pulpit complex in that church. Too many people act like they are the pastor, spouting out their opinions and wanting to be the big shot in that little sandbox." Steve said, after which he confirmed that the church was only 2 blocks away from the library.
Emboldened by the prospect of having discovered where Santana was, Maldonado headed for the House of Mercy Pentecostal Church. Before he knew it, Maldonado stood at the main entrance of the worship space, where he noticed the name of the minister, the Reverend Angel Santana, imprinted on a sign. The name of the minister prominently featured made him think that his former partner not only emerged unscathed from the insurance scandal, but that he also landed well on his feet. Using guile and manipulation, Maldonado called the number on the church sign and was able to gather information from the person at the other end of the conversation that confirmed his hunch. After wrapping up his conversation, Maldonado remembered Steve's words at the library about Santana's woes. Maldonado immediately sensed the political vacuum within the church as an opportunity to unleash more chaos and anguish in Santana's life. Maldonado felt a surge of power as he imagined the pieces of his plot falling into place. He would destroy Santana for betraying him. "You can hide your religious garb, right behind your religious garb, and fool your congregants, but you're not fooling me. I know who you are. I know your history. Soon your congregation will know who you really are as well," he told himself in a loud and intense internal dialogue. Santana's world was already unraveling, with his personal life in turmoil and a faction of his congregation approaching with daggers ready to bring him to his knees. In the meantime, a vile presence lurked. A foe prowled. An old debt had to be resolved. Little did Pastor Santana know that as he sought to draw closer to God, another revolue was swirling around him. Santana was engrossed in a prayer and fasting retreat at his congregation for the 3rd straight day. He felt anxious because of the harassing tactics of a vocal faction inside his church. Santana's opponents were succeeding at driving away congregants, hurting the church's finances, and criticizing Santana's family over petty things. On top of all this, Santana was still grieving the loss of his son Gregorio to an overdose and the declining health of another son who was rumored to be sick with AIDS. Santana's wife had had enough and pleaded with him to consider a new career. Amid his trials and tribulations, Santana was conflicted about what to do and prayed to the Almighty for a sign that would allow him to discern what path he should take. And a sign appeared. It came in the form of a silhouette, and then it came in the form of a vague presence. The minister's eyes were so tired they shed tears, and he could not immediately discern who or what the blurry image was approaching him in his office. The obscure figure opened the dialogue with a remark in a sly and mocking tone. "Are you meditating on the Lord? Or are you falling asleep on your flock, Pastor?" Maldonado's voice intoned. The pastor asked, "Do you have an appointment?" The visitor, draped in a wet coat from a cold rain, resisted immediately answering the question. Instead, he quickly approached the pastor's desk. And when he stood against the side of the desk, he removed his wire-rimmed glasses and nonchalantly said, "Destiny never schedules an appointment." Maldonado's words were not the prophetic oracle that Santana wanted to hear. His presence was not the celestial messenger that his eyes were longing to see. It was obviously a depressing moment for the already beleaguered pastor. The circumstances demanded the pastor quickly unmask the intentions of this intruder, who was not a stranger to him. Although many years had passed away since they were business associates sharing office space, they recognized one easily because neither had changed much physically. Santana hadn't really been keeping track of Maldonado and just assumed he would not return out of decency or fear of the people he's been accused of defrauding. The pastor was so bewildered by Maldonado's sudden and unheralded resurrection that he could not react quickly enough to prevent his former business partner's aggressive charge toward his office desk. Maldonado smiled with his eyes, but not with his mouth. The words he spoke were tinged with rancor and insincerity. "I am interested in helping each other out." The minister clasped his hands together tightly to calm his fear. He turned down Maldonado's offer to help. "I don't know what you are getting at, but I really don't need your help," Santana said. What was hinted at next by Maldonado placed the pastor in a quandary. "I know things about you that could force you out of this position," Maldonado threatened, alluding to the shady demise of the insurance business that had ruined one partner but not the other. "I want the church's sexton job, and I know the position is available. I saw it in the help wanted pages of the paper. Your wonderful secretary confirmed that you have not hired anyone for that position." The minister tried to dismiss him with a gracious response. "Guillaume, come back on Sunday. We can talk with my key people after worship," Santana said. Maldonado sensed that his former partner was buying time in order to come up with an excuse to turn him down for the job. He rushed ahead, intent on outmaneuvering Santana. "I need to know right now when I can start my new job and move in," Maldonado said, not in the least bit concerned about his commitment to staying at the halfway house called Healing Hearts. "And don't you ever call me Guillaume. That person no longer exists for you. He died a long time ago." The minister buckled under the pressure. Sunday. Maldonado grinned and retrieved his monogrammed handkerchief to wipe off the water on his left hand. He extended his left hand of fellowship to consummate the deal. Santana hesitated at first, and after gradually stretching his hand to meet Maldonado's cold, moist hand, his hand was firmly rotated counterclockwise into a submissive position. Years ago, when Maldonado started out in business, Santana taught him to shake a customer's hand by placing his hand always on top It was a technique designed to establish psychological superiority in a transactional moment. Now Santana's lesson had been turned 180 degrees around him. Prior to exiting the building, the church's secretary gave Maldonado a tour of the former janitor's living space and pointed out the window to show Maldonado the church's private lot and the spot where he could park his car. She even gave him a set of keys. Maldonado twirled them energetically, luxuriating in the feeling that he was taking charge of his circumstances. Santana did not take Maldonado's twirling of the keys as a benign and amusing act. He took it as a taunt. Maldonado had the master keys to the church, and those set of keys symbolize power and unlimited access. Maldonado, with a sprightly bounce, marched off to his car.
Poor Santana. What a voulu. Whenever Santana faced a crucible, he did one of two things. First, he applied a layer of his cosmetic, pastoral aura in order to look fresh and feel good about himself. The pastoral aura was made up of a face scrub of a Dead Sea product, an oil fragrance from the Holy Land that he spread over his forehead in the sign of a cross, and a dab of pomade that would make the texture of his hair look glassy. The second thing he did was to visit with his former Catholic priest, Father Roberto, for comfort and wisdom. His visits with the priest were an odd and risky thing to do. If his detractors uncovered his dual spiritual allegiances, the Roman and the Pentecostal, he would lose his standing as a sincere preacher and be seen as a religious hypocrite. In public, Santana would normally eviscerate the Catholic Church from the pulpit, but in private, he felt a nostalgic attachment to the Catholic Church that he was raised in and to his former priest, Father Roberto. The priest knew of Santana's quandary, and as a spiritual advisor, he never judged Santana. Santana drove to Father Roberto's office and was discreetly taken by the parish's secretary to the priest's office. Father Roberto was filled with joy to see Santana. He threw his arms around him and gave him a strong bear hug. Father Roberto asked, "How have you been? How is your family? When are you going to have me over for some of Minerva's rice and beans?" Santana dropped his head. His carefully applied pastoral aura was not able to mask his pain. He mumbled in a feeble voice how things were getting worse. He spoke of Minerva's constant state of melancholy and his children's crisis of faith. Santana even went on to make reference to the gossip at the church about his children's lifestyle, including his son's sexual orientation and deteriorating health condition. As troubling as all of these things were, that was not the reason Santana drove to meet with Father Roberto. He wanted to discuss the reappearance of a past problem. Santana said to Father Roberto, "Maldonado is back." With wary eyes, Father Roberto asked, "Who is back?" "Maldonado," Santana said. He broke the name William Maldonado into syllables for clarity and emphasis. Santana wanted the priest to help him articulate, in a nutshell, what may have influenced Maldonado to return. Father Roberto did not take long to answer. He said, "Passion." "Passion?" Santana questioned. Father Roberto explained. "Passion in the form of revenge. Revenge has the same tenacity, perseverance that love has." The priest added, "The same passion that drove him to work hard for you is the same passion driving him to confront you to deal with an unresolved lust for revenge." Father Roberto encouraged Santana not to blame Maldonado for his determination to exorcise his demons. The priest said that, while knowing full well it was the pastor's oldest and now deceased son who pocketed the money that was supposed to go for the payment of the monthly insurance premiums, the policy subsequently lapsed and each policyholder was without insurance protection. And that Maldonado got the blame for it. Father Roberto was bound by his vocation to uphold confidentiality, but he tried to share with Santana in an oblique way that Maldonado was not the one responsible for the insurance debacle. Santana's own son, Gregorio, the eldest, who worked under Maldonado, used the client's cash payments to settle an old drug debt, and he managed to make Maldonado the sacrificial lamb. The priest knew the oldest deceased son's deceptive practices firsthand because the son revealed the scheme to him on numerous occasions during counseling and confession. Father Roberto tried to get Santana's oldest son to talk about his misdeed to his father or the authorities, but he died of an overdose before he had the chance to make things right. Father Roberto tried to help Santana embrace Maldonado's surprise visit as a gift from above, to reconcile matters and experience wholeness. He said, "The people whom God places in our life are designed to teach us something about ourselves that we are ignoring, for self-awareness comes by being in relationship, and the people whom God places in our path are designed to give us a skill, a perspective, a resource that we need to help us transition from one phase of living to another." Santana did not think the priest was being fair. He shrugged his shoulders and threw his arms up in the air as a sign of reproach. Father Roberto quoted in Spanish as saying that Santana taught him many years ago when he started his ministry at the parish. The priest said in Spanish, "Dios aprieta, pero no ahorca." God squeezes, but does not strangle.
The Sunday following Santana's meeting with Father Roberto, Santana knew that a revolú was looming in the form of a new antagonist. He nonetheless resolved to fake enthusiasm and open the doors of the church for his flock to enter the sanctuary. One by one, the pastor's faithful remnant and his opponents alike walked into the church. The worshipers, in a short procession, entered into the sanctuary area, some clutching a Bible, others holding fast to hand instruments such as tambourines, maracas, guiros, and cowbells. Within minutes of promenading into the sanctuary, the sacred space was filled by the worshipers' spontaneous chatter. This was a time known as personal prayer, and it took place before the start of the official part of the worship service. 20 minutes into the time of personal prayer, the loud chatter that marked the start of the prayer session gradually became a subdued whisper. The hushed voices cued the lead guitarist and choir director to strum his chords in fast scales. The flamenco-styled rhythm churned out by the choir director and his percussionist band stirred worshipers into a frenzy of clapping, singing, dancing, and playing of hand instruments. Maldonado was taken aback by the commotion. He asked himself, what kind of revolú did I get myself into? There was so much to absorb. Not only was this his first time seeing his former insurance partner in action in his new persona as man of God and leader of a religious community, but the energy in the Pentecostal faith tradition was new and overwhelming to the sometime Catholic Maldonado. Maldonado acclimated himself to the style of worship, mimicking some of the worship behaviors and mumbling along with some of the songs, particularly those songs that were made up of few verses that were repeated endlessly. The one thing, however, that Maldonado had a hard time concealing was his discomfort with how the service dragged on and on. He twitched in his pew on several occasions and did the best he could to endure the monotony of the service. Immediately after the benediction, the members greeted each other in a flurry of handshakes and affectionate hugs, with the men hugging only the men, and the women hugging and kissing only the women. Little by little, worshipers broke off into cliques and headed to the church's social hall. He sat in a corner, his eyes zeroed in on one of the cliques populating the large social hall. When he finally made up his mind to join a clique, he walked up to a group and introduced himself as the new sexton. He immediately made an impression with his charm. After getting a feel for a clique, he darted to another group to listen to what they were saying. Some conversations he thought were strange and trivial, focusing on who sported an untamed mustache and who wore skirts that hovered above the knee and fell short of the standards of holy living. Other conversations were divisive and degrading, and it was these conversations that interested him the most. They engendered feelings of self-righteous indignation against Santana's struggling ministry, even touching upon his family. There was one clique in particular where the members were so close that they vacationed and ate Sunday brunch together. And it seemed that as each person in that group spoke, the comments got worse and worse. Then a man with flattened wavy hair, fox-like eyes, a neatly shaved mustache, and trimmed sideburns above his temples waded into the conversation. He removed his brown hands from his long-sleeve white guayabera pockets and started to talk with over-brimming zeal. The man known as Chico felt that he needed to punish Santana on behalf of God. Chico said, "The Spirit has left this church. Without the Spirit, we are not going to have souls saved or join the church, for the Spirit brings about conviction. Without the Spirit, there is nothing but decay and death." The members of the clique looked at each other in fear. They did not want their beloved church to close down, which would be the inevitable outcome of knocking Pastor Santana off his perch. Chico continued, "Things are going bad, and they're going to get worse. There is a grave sin being covered up in this church. We must expose and uproot that sin." The conversation took a sharper turn when Chico bared his hand and made a chopping gesture as if to suggest that the sword of judgment was going to cut through the air. The clique's hostility and Chico's theatrics made Maldonado smile. He delighted in the spite shown towards Santana. Maldonado said his goodbyes and withdrew to his room. His main interest was in exploring how to further inflame Chico's clique to battle against the pastor. He knew that he could use Chico's clique as a proxy to exact his revenge.
Maldonado was barely back in his tiny bedroom when he started to chronicle in his journal the personalities at the House of Mercy Pentecostal Church. He wrote about the frenzy of the service and some of the colorful personalities he had just met. And after he wrote his colorful vignettes about the more memorable church members, he pondered how he could influence the group that was scornful towards Santana. His pondering led him to come up with a Machiavellian idea. One Sunday, after morning worship ended, Maldonado wove his way into the circle of tightly compressed bodies and motioned with his hands that he needed to talk. He convinced Chico's clique, which held the best singers in the church choirs, to drop out of the Christmas Eve musical program. The clique resisted the idea at first, thinking that is sacrilegious, but they eventually capitulated to Chico's pressure and Maldonado's manipulative arguments. One by one, the choir members who were part of Chico's clique wielded flimsy excuses to drop out of the choir. The news of their resignation created panic and concern among the remaining choir members and the choir's director. But Santana took the challenge as an opportunity to fight back. Sometimes a rebellion turns the most benign person into a political animal, making that person play a cat and mouse game in order to survive. Sensing Maldonado's and Chico's foul hand at play, Santana instructed the choir director to change his recruiting policy to include non-members and inactive members and to hold rehearsals at the house of a church loyalist. The choir director followed through on that plan, and on Christmas Eve, the choir director unveiled a dynamic choir that led the congregation in interactive, folksy Christmas songs. The give and take singing went on for about 30 minutes. If the service ended there, Santana would have accomplished his mission in creating a meaningful and inspirational service. But he wasn't done. After the singing concluded, he gave a meditation on the importance of making room in the human heart for the Christmas spirit to be born. He could have ended it there, but he wasn't done. He announced he had a special thank you gift for the church in the form of 2 mystery guests. Those mystery guests were Santana's former predecessors, the Reverends Miguel and Olga Montez, both of whom were popular. Their appearance set the congregation into a frenzy. The Reverend Olga Montez spoke about the new outreach work they were doing as retirees with immigrants' children. And the Reverend Miguel Montez cleared his throat and sang in his sublime tenor voice, "Oh, holy night." The congregation was memorized by his pious demeanor, sweet voice, the vocal evocation of the nativity scene. The Reverend Montez had sung that same song as a soloist during the Christmas Eve service for 30 straight years. No one had ever measured up to singing "O Holy Night" after he retired. And when he finished, he realized many were in tears. When the service ended, at least for one night, hard feelings among the factions were softened. Santana's successful evening service made him popular with his congregation again, like the day he was installed as their new pastor. The worshipers filed into the fellowship hall to break bread and share stories during the annual Christmas Eve pork roast and potluck dinner. Chico, unrepentant, did not attend. He gathered his clique and told them he did not want to hear anything about Santana's triumphant evening. What Chico did not realize at that moment is that sulking over a rebellion can lead to more misery and suffering.
Not long after Christmas Eve debacle, Maldonado got an inkling that the tide was turning in favor of Santana. He decided to reassess his life and get rid of his own Revolu, the stolen car, which had become a beloved albatross. Sometimes Revolu creates a finite moment to do what is good in the face of moral conflict. One day, Steve was on his way to the scrapyard, pushing a cart brimming with recyclable materials. Along the way, a car drove slowly past him. The car suddenly stopped, but the engine was left running. The driver tapped the horn, opened the window, and asked, "Amigo, do you need a lift?" Steve lowered his head to see who was driving and accepted the ride. "Sure, I am headed to the scrapyard," Steve said. Maldonado nodded in approval. Steve smiled at Maldonado's relaxed mood. Steve quickly asked Maldonado to open the trunk, not wanting Maldonado to regret giving him a ride in the event his bags leaked. Maldonado agreed. He struggled to find the lever to unlock the trunk. Steve found it odd that Maldonado didn't know where the lever to his own car was located. Maldonado felt uncomfortable with Steve staring at him. He turned his face to the opposite direction and ran his hand under the steering wheel. "Damn it, where are you?" Maldonado asked. He could not figure out how to unlock the trunk. He finally decided to turn off the car and give Steve his keys to open the trunk from the outside. "Here," Maldonado said. "It's one of these 3 keys." Steve went to the rear of the car and managed to pop open the trunk. He was surprised to see that the suitcase that once occupied the back seat was now in the trunk of the car. Very discreetly, Steve unzippered the suitcase and rummaged gently through it, unbeknown to Maldonado, who was still chilling in the driver's seat. Steve was stunned to see that the suitcase held women's garments, and the owner's tag had a feminine name. He didn't know what to think about that. He didn't say a word. He deposited his bag and closed the trunk. He took a seat on the passenger side, returned Maldonado's keys, and gave a prompt, clear directions. 2 blocks into their ride, Steve made an attempt to change the radio dial from the classical to a contemporary station.
Maldonado found that behavior pushy. "What are you doing?" asked Maldonado. Steve responded, "I don't like to listen to dead people's music. You know, the stuff they play at funerals. That kind of music can be depressing at times." Maldonado didn't like Steve's characterization of classical music. "This music is not a fad. It has endured through the ages. It has enlightened civilizations," Maldonado said. "Just sit back and appreciate it. This is," Steve said in a rapid-fire response, "Bach, composition for violin. He's got that distinctive sound." "Yes, that is Bach in D minor," Maldonado said. "I'm impressed. You've got a good ear." "Ha, scholar, I pick up on everything. I just wanted something up-tempo to inspire me," Steve said. Maldonado felt his music was inspirational, but he didn't want to debate that point with Steve. He needed a personal favor. He acted congenially. Very good. You make an insightful point, Maldonado said. Maldonado quickly changed the subject. I need a personal favor, Maldonado said. Shoot, be direct, Steve said. Maldonado spoke in a worried voice. This car was given to me as a payment for a bad loan. I took it, but I'm having second thoughts about that decision, Maldonado said. Steve couldn't figure out Maldonado's source of internal conflict. Did they give you a lemon? Does the car burn through gas? Maldonado noted that the car was reliable and good on gas. No, the car runs smoothly. It's very economical, Maldonado said. Steve was getting frustrated with Maldonado's cryptic language and mind games. So what is the problem? Why do you talk in riddles? Get to the point. Maldonado said, I am having a premonition. I'm just not sure that this car actually belongs to the guy who gave it to me. Steve read between the lines. What? Am I in a stolen car? Are you bugging? Don't panic, don't exaggerate. Nothing has happened, friend, Maldonado said. Don't panic. I can lose my scholarship money if I'm involved in a felony. Let me out, man, Steve protested. Steve insisted that Maldonado pull over and drop him off. Maldonado grabbed Steve by the forearm and said, Hey, you said when I met you that your generosity is limitless for the right price. Yeah, something like that, Steve said. I will give a sizable commission if you help me get rid of this car. So, how can you help me? Steve sat in an erect posture and started to run options, demonstrating his knowledge of the underworld. He floated the idea of leaving the car running in a seedy neighborhood to tempt a curious person to take the car for a joyride. Steve also discussed the idea of having the car dismantled at an illegal garage known as a chop shop. The car is dismantled and its parts are then sold to a local junkyard. The best part of this operation is the engine serial number is filed off. The connection to its registered owner and to you will be gone permanently, Steve said. That sounds great. Wait, we're here, Steve said, making reference to the entrance of the scrapyard. Steve retrieved his bag from the trunk and thanked Maldonado. He departed with his bags and parting words. When you're ready, let me know, Steve said. You know where to find me. Maldonado grappled with the question of what to do with the car. He wondered why people carried things with them in life that were just not that easy to get rid of. After giving his dilemma some thought, he decided to keep the car. He said he would repent the theft at a more convenient time and restore the moral balance that had been eluding him. Will Maldonado eventually abandon the stolen car? Will he abandon his revenge? Aye, what a revelou!
will be glad to talk to you outside. Oblong Books is here. We have copies of Luis's book. He will autograph it for you. Please buy it because he won't get any royalties unless you do. Also, the Rhinebeck crew team is here. We have light refreshment. It is complimentary, but please make a donation to them. Please. There are also donation buckets for other things. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.